So, hey YouTube, my name is Chris and this is your beautiful reading for whenever you find it, but it's kind of time specific and it's a global reading for all frequent signs of the zodiac. It's for everybody. Summer 2026 globally, right? What is happening? We're wrapping something up. We're done with something old, right? And what would that be? That would be the old system, the old way of dealing with things coming to an end fairly quickly. That's what I talked about, like the 2008 circle that was started in 2008 with Pluto in Aquarius came to an end already. We are fully in Pluto in Aquarius, and we also finished the 9 respectively 10-year cycle since 9-10 years ago, right? Which was very, very toxic. And now we got some healing to do, and we have to move forward collectively with a new approach, much more in harmony between the thinking aspect, which we kind of overrepresented, totally one-sidedness, right? We kind of focused all of our attention and built our entire system on pure intellect, right? And now Pluto in Aquarius, we're rediscovering our emotional body, and there's a lot of healing to do because we kind of neglected this emotional frequency of our existence for quite a while, right? So there is work to do, and the work is pretty much, a lot of the work is basically accepting that, right? Just working on seeing it as a blessing, especially the people who are completely one-sided, rational, when you just think you know everything and everything is kind of calculatable and utilitarian, and you can basically ask AI for it and it's going to be figured out because it's based on logic and intellect, right? And that is one side of it, right? I'm not negating this. I'm kind of a scientist myself, sort of, right? Certainly big in philosophy, but it's not either or. There's a spiritual side of it where things are just not so linear, right? In mathematics and logic, in conventional one-sided science, everything is super linear. But it's not about lines, it's not about triangles or squares or rectangles or whatever, Not everything has to be linear or kind of pixelated, It can be much more than that, right? And this other dimension of potentiality, of your own untidy subconsciousness, your own emotions, your own feelings, your own passions, all that is part of it too. And it needs to be there, and it needs to be integrated with all that purely intellectual approach that we've seen since 2008, Pluto in Capricorn, that's for sure. There are 2 or 3. Okay, let's just take them. Oh, it's even 4? No, 3. Yeah, we're waking up to something else. There's a new consciousness here. And this consciousness is not just the intellect, is not just, cold, steelish, right? There's the Ace of Swords, right? But we use this consciousness, this intellectual mind, to sit down to meditate, to do, mindfulness work, right? To transcend and integrate your own shadow aspect, to do shadow work. So you use the intellect. You're not negating the intellect. You're not saying all that was wrong. You're just saying, okay, that was wrong in its one-sidedness, but not wrong in itself, but just in its one-sided approach. Everything needed to be rational, right? But there's a different dimension to our life, our beings, and we're waking up to that, to a transformed consciousness. And the thought, the energy, the intellect is still there and appreciated, not negated, but transcended and integrated. And kind of, it's like an orchestra, you know, like a solo player suddenly joins an orchestra. You're no longer just in your mind, basically, in your intellectual 3D causality consciousness mind, but you experience potentiality, all sorts of possibilities. You experience that life can change in a heartbeat, basically, right? Completely transform itself. All that is hard to explain for the purely conscious intellectual mind. In other words, we have to acknowledge, I'm not saying that there's magic and woo-woo everywhere, but there are just unexplored, ununderstood things and functionalities that we just don't get. We might not be able to observe them with our pure physical senses. There might be a different approach to it, to meditation, to breath work, something like that, right? Which is kind of not yet fully understood by science. But to negate it, just to negate it because it's not fully explorable through the conventional means of science, right? Pure rationality, that doesn't mean it's not there. In this other dimension, which is all about your heart space, your emotion, your emotional body, your passion, not just what you're willing to suffer for, but now it's much more about being joyful and creative with your passion, you know? The suffering part is the first part of passion. First you suffer for it. You go to university, you get your degree, you do this, you do that. You fall on your face when you learn to ride your bike, you know, you swallow a lot of water when you learn to swim. So there's a suffering aspect to it. But if you're passionate about it, if you like to do it, eventually you learn to swim, right? And you enjoy swimming. You don't need to drown every time. You don't have to relearn swimming. You can just, you know, the hard part is over and then you enjoy it. And this is pretty much the frequency of 2026. The hard part is over. And now we begin to enjoy it. And we begin to enjoy it by not negating, you know, we have been totally one-sided as a collective globally in our intellectual approach of everything, right? And you could say, okay, so let's try the other extreme, right? And be totally woo-woo and tarot card readings and, you know, do just that, right? And negate the pure intellect. That's just as bad as the other extreme, because evil or destructiveness, dysfunctionality is not a specific form. It's not the intellect or your emotional body or your intuition or your subconsciousness or esoteric, so to speak, that working, that inner working, right, is just as good or bad as the intellect. The question is, how do you bring those two together, right? Do you bring them in a balance or do you play them against each other? And we have been in this one-sided mindset where it needed to be you either there or you're there, but you can't be kind of both. And that both end is what we're exploring and what we're living through or into. And that is pretty much the core principle of the new paradigm. The next 20 years, my friend. Pluto in Aquarius, that's what it's all about. So, flow states, coming together, transcendence, integration. That's the new consciousness, the Ace of Swords. We're waking up to this because these other dimensions of just consciousness, right? It's like, you know, a solo player of a violin enters an orchestra, right? Or joins an orchestra. That doesn't negate him playing the violin, right? On the contrary, he's just joining an orchestra. That doesn't mean that in an orchestra, the violin is not fighting against the oboe or, you know, whatever, right? That's ridiculous. No, they play together and build something that none of these in its isolation could ever do on their own, right? That's the sum is greater. The end, the sum is greater than the sum of its part. The whole is greater than the sum of its part. That's how it is, right? And we are waking up to that. And some people will, you know, be more resistant to it. And collectively, we're working to overcome that resistance, right? And that resistance is just the habit of the old system, of that one-sided mindset. there's the Five of Cups. We're moving on from, you know, disappointments and things like that, right? A few cups got spilled, that's for sure, but you're moving on to it. And there is reciprocity, there is a balancing movement, right? So if you have given a lot, then it's time for you to receive. Summer 2026 might make a big difference in that regard, because especially last 9 years, 10 years, pretty much since 2008, but it goes far, far beyond 2008 back into time. It is kind of a narcissistic world, and it's kind of a world or a system. The old system was pretty much tuned and optimized for narcissistic abuse, you know? If you ripped off other people, if you diminished other people, if you pushed others down in order to give yourself the false sense of elevation, that was your system, right? That system was totally supporting that. And yeah, making sure that people who do that, behave like that, were better off than someone who is decent and, you know, says basic principles of human decency and things like that. That was laughed about, that was considered to be weak. Everything that was emotional, intuitive, intrinsic was kind of ridiculed, basically. And we're coming out of this, right? And some of us are working on this, need to work on this harder than others, and for others it's just over time, and we're finally arriving there. And if you've been more on the empathic side, you're going to be very happy about this Six of Pentacles, because most likely a lot was taken from you, and then you give you get something back, right? Balancing, Six of Pentacles. If you've received a lot, it's time to give, and if you have given a lot, it's time to receive. In these times of complete transformation, right, we just have to keep our cool, right? And how do we do this? The Four of Swords is here as well. That's how you use your mind, your intellect, for awareness, right? Mindfulness and meditation, breath work. You know, just sitting there, contemplating, watching your thoughts roll by, like, you know, you watch the clouds or something like that. That is also a training of the mind, of the consciousness, of the intellect. So we're not negating the intellect. That's not at all what's happening here. We're just saying, did you notice, right? There's so much more than just that. And if you bring all of these together, the emotional body, the intuitive, intrinsic body, then of course the analytical mind, the intellect, right? Concept thinking, duality consciousness, space-time, and things like that, right? Causality, that is all of the mind, basically. And if you bring that together with the here and now, with what is true in your emotional body, in your intuitive subconscious frequency, if you bring that together, and you get everything you need, right? There's the Page of Pentacles, there's the Page of Cups, but there's also the Seven of Cups. It is a choice, right? So you have to make that choice. Do you want that? Or do you want to stay in this one-sided mindset? But summer 2026 is, I think we all feel that we should take that cup, right? And stop being grumpy, looking onto our 3 cups, you know. Maybe a few cups got spilled in the past, so you could mourn that all day, or you just stand up, right? That's the Page of Wands. Come here. He's just standing up from that disappointment, turning his back to it, and he's moving, right? He's moving along, he's exploring another chapter, and that new chapter, it's all about the transcendence and integration. You're moving on from that, of your thinking intellectual mind and the emotional mind, I would say. 2 of Cups should show up somewhere. Yeah, there's the 5 of Cups again. Then we got, yes, there's some heartbreak here, of course. Queen of Wands, working with your subconsciousness. And one more. Try not to force anything. That's very important. Be kind to yourself. We're all in this as a learning process. We are integrating higher consciousness, basically, different ways of thinking, different dimensions of thinking. Yeah, right? Just a different way of dealing with your consciousness. Breathwork, meditation, super important. Self-compassion, self-love, give yourself a break, don't force anything. And there will be, we're kind of here on the more empathic side on this channel. If you're resonating with this, share, like, subscribe, leave a comment, let me know what you think about it. But I would say if you watch this video this far, you're kind of more on the empathic side, right? And, sorry, empathic people used to question themselves, right? Or introspect and, am I doing it right? Question themselves. And often enough, sometimes empathic people ask external validation or ask other people for advice. And since they don't know, they think other people might know. But you know what? Most likely, the empathic person has thought about something like 100 million times deeper and more, what is the word? More precisely than anybody that person might ever ask, right? So maybe they just have more authority or speak with more clarity, and pretend as if they know. Maybe they even believe. That's the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? Maybe they even believe that they know it, but usually empathic people have thought about it way deeper and more complex than anybody of those who think they know. So those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. That is a big shadow that is kind of hanging over the summer of 2026 in general, globally. So don't believe absurdities. Uphold your principles, right? Stand up for what you believe, stand up for authenticity and integrity, and just don't fall into this trap. The end does not justify the means. The end does never ever justify any means, right? And when I see the Three of Swords, the Four of Cups, the Five of Cups 2 times actually, and that need to move on from that 2 times the Page of Wands, not forcing it, but be kind to yourself, right? But there's a quote here, not everyone leaves your life as a loss. Some losses are blessings in disguise. And accepting that is part of the healing process. And especially if you have a broken heart, something like that, right? Disappointment, narcissistic abuse. It is harder to work with your subconsciousness because, of course, in your subconsciousness, there's all the grief, all the shame, guilt, fear, grief, anger, frustration, right? Sorrow, hopelessness, you name it, right? All the trauma stuff is kind of shoved down into your subconsciousness, and it's kind of blocking the access to higher realms of healing and higher realms of consciousness. So first you have to deal with that kind of bundle of traumatic experiences, right? And heal it. And you're not healing it by shoving it under the rock. You're not healing it by negating it. You're healing it by bringing it up and looking at it, right? And being able to stand that and dissolve it, not by fighting it, but by taming it, right? By reintegrating it. And that is a healing process. And for some people that might be harder than it is for others, right? Depending on how much trauma there is blocking your subconsciousness. But we have to deal with that in order to open the channel again, that it was totally blocked by trauma. And that is part of the integration process in 2026. The form of the form of evil is one-sidedness. So never forget that whenever they present you with a scapegoat, right? It's about these people and their fault. No. That's usually bullshit, because it's never the form that is bad or evil or dysfunctional. it's always the one-sidedness itself, right? It's not this side, it's not this nation or this religion or these people or that people. No, it's not one side, it's one-sidedness. If you say it's just them, then there's something wrong with it, right? Okay, sorry. Then let's just see what comes up. Some people will never like you because your spirit irritates their demons. Denzel Washington. That's what it is. Okay, so enough said for 2026 summer. It's going to be a hot summer. It's going to be, yeah, and just let me do one more. Yeah. So there's sadness and there's enlightenment, and it's almost as if these two are mirrors to each other, because one is 12 and one is 21, basically. So sadness and enlightenment. And if you explore these different layers of consciousness that have been pretty much blocked by trauma and guilt, fear, shame, right? If you deal with the guilt, fear, shame and the trauma, if you reintegrate that and you just let it go and let it dissolve, basically. If you are doing that work, if you have done that work through meditation, through breath work, you're opening the channel to your emotions, your passions, not in suffering for your passion, but in joyful creation of your passion. Two of Wands, 2 times the Page of Wands is here. For some it will be a sad time, right? Because you're dealing with all that stuff that you shove down there into your subconsciousness. But through dealing with it, you're opening the channel for something so much more beautiful. And that's the number 12, which is enlightenment, which sounds bigger than it needs to be. You're just learning something, you're transcending and integrating something. And that's the invitation for summer 2026 globally for all of us. We can reject that invitation, right? We can say, no, we're not taking that cup. That's too much work. I have to deal with all that heartbreak, right? There is heartbreak in that cup. Past trauma is in that cup. But in that cup is also self-love. In that cup is divine love. In that cup is endless creativity and inner peace. But you have to deal with that which you shoved down there because you didn't want to deal with it, right? So for some people that is too big to deal with it, and for some people it will be manageable to deal with that and open the blessing of that. That's the Ace of Cups basically that is offered to him. But of course, right? It's only through your subconsciousness, and you have to deal with whatever happened in the past and is kind of, down there, stuff there. So that's 2026, summer 2026. It's going to be intense, but if you love yourself, if you respect yourself, if you be yourself a friend, right? How would you deal with a friend if that friend would be in your own situation? I guess you would be much kinder, right? Especially if you're on the empathic side. Most likely you would not be, as harsh and hard to your friend as sometimes you might be to yourself. So be yourself a friend, and, there's a lot of beauty here, right? There's the new consciousness, waking up to it. The hard part is that acceptance and radical transformation part, but there's meditation. There is the Knight of Cups. There's the Six of Pentacles. There's the Queen of Cups. So everything is unfolding if you allow it to unfold. And that's all I got. Now I shut up. My voice is already a little, off. But share, like, subscribe, leave a comment, let me know what you think about it. There is the yearly reading for you to check out. And if you want the full picture for your sign of the zodiac, there's a reading for you. Check out Sun, Moon, and Rising sign if you want the full picture. And that's all I got now. But see you next time. Ciao.